Hello and welcome back to another update as we cover the latest developments throughout the front line in the Russo-Ukrainian war. We start out in the direction of Robotyne, where there has been some developments here. First off, to the west of Robotyne, there has been some advancements which were confirmed by geolocated footage, which shows the Russians capturing the last parts of the trenches to the west of Robotyne, and with this the Russians have control over the fortifications to the west of the village. As for the southern parts, the Russians gained control over those yesterday, and with this the Russians have control over the fortifications both to the south and to the west of Robotyne. With this, there were reports earlier today, just recently, of a Russian foothold within the village. This will likely only be confirmed later if the case is true, as these footages that confirmed the locations and geolocations of the new recent Russian advances came from yesterday and not today. As such, the confirmations were late, and therefore the advancements could have happened in between the time of the report and now. So with this, we see that the Russians are launching attacks towards the village itself and the surrounding areas, trying to gain control over the fortifications, which they have succeeded to the south and to the west of the village. And now the fighting is taking place within the village, according to the latest reports. The fighting over Robotyne is to negate the gains the Ukrainians made in their summer offensive. If the Russians managed to gain control over Robotyne, they could move northwest in the direction of Novodanilivka to the north and move in a northeastern direction to cut off the Ukrainian soldiers here to the east of Robotyne. It is clear that the Russians are now operating on a double envelopment to cut off the Ukrainians in this bulge here to the southeast of Robotyne. The way they're doing this is that they're launching the attacks here to the west of Verbove, where they're trying to gain control over the anti-tank ditch that moves through the northwest of Verbove, which would cut off any Ukrainian soldiers remaining onto the east of these parts west of Verbove, and connect that with an assault on Robotyne, which will capture the village and then connect the two sides from each side, enveloping the Ukrainian soldiers in the center and then moving in a northern direction towards Novodanilivka while capturing the fortifications and trenches throughout the area. According to the latest reports, the weather conditions here in the Zaporizhzhia front are very poor. There's a lot of mud in the whole area, which means that only infantry can move through, and it's very difficult for supplies to arrive and drive through the front line. The main supply road is the highway that goes here from Novodanilivka to Robotyne. As such, the Russian attacks towards Robotyne from the western direction threatens that supply route, which would essentially cut off all supplies to these southeastern parts of Robotyne and refuse further reinforcements, while the Russians have a significant manpower advantage considering two whole divisions are fighting over the Robotyne direction and the surrounding areas by the Verbove and Novoprokopivka direction. So with that, we see that the situation in the Zaporizhzhia front has returned from passive to active, and the Russians are taking advantage of their superior firepower and manpower in this section to launch these offensive operations, which so far has seen positive results for the Russians. We then move on to the Avdiivka direction. Here we see that the Russians continue their operations to the west of Avdiivka. There's been no reported gains by the Russians, but it is reported that the fighting has reached Lastoshkine, and the village itself is involved in fighting as the Russians press on westwards from the city. As such, we see that the situation in the Avdiivka front is developing as well. It is reported that the Russians are planning to prevent the Ukrainians from establishing a new defensive line. As such, there's no operational pause in the Avdiivka direction, and the Russians will continue their offensive operations until they reach the next defensive line to prevent the Ukrainians from establishing proper positions there and consolidating their positions. Meanwhile, the Russians are sending additional reinforcements to the Avdiivka direction to consolidate their gains and rotate out the soldiers who are too tired or the ones who have been lost. Moving further north in the direction of Bakhmut, yet again we see further developments, and here it is reported that the Russians are storming the village of Ivanivsk. Here to the west of Bakhmut, the Russians have managed to capture all of the forest lines and fortifications to the east of Ivanivsk. As such, the Russians now held positions in a 90-degree angle to the north and east of Ivanivsk, and with these positions, the Russians are going to be attacking from a northern direction to cut off the road here to the west of Ivanivsk, and they're going to press on to get a foothold within the village from the northeast and northeastern and eastern positions here by the village. With these developments, we see that the Russians are now constantly on the move, trying to take important positions such as Ivanivsk to pressure the Ukrainian positions and continue their offensive operations. It seems that the Ukrainian hope that the Russians would run out of steam as soon as winter ended and that they could regain the initiative and launch their own offensive operations here in the spring season is nothing but a fairy tale, as it seems that the Russians, as I predicted and as I've stated multiple times, are recruiting more soldiers than they're losing on the front line. As such, they theoretically can continue the fighting endlessly, and as such, the Russians are now on a constant offensive operations until the Ukrainians at some point build up a large enough reserve force, they receive significant weaponry reinforcements and so on. The current trend will not change. The Russians will continue having the initiative and be on the offensive until the war ends. December of last year, on the 5th of December, I wrote this tweet: "For Ukraine, the war has already been lost. It becomes worse and worse the more days go by. Without direct interference by Western nations, Ukraine can never win this war. And so far, it has aged perfectly. Since the 5th of December, the situation has become worse and worse for Ukraine the more days go by, eventually leading to the collapse of Avdiivka. Biden calls this the reason for this, the lack of funding from Congress. They aren't passing the bill. I'm saying that in reality, even if Congress passed the bill, it would still continue in this direction because the aid is not enough. What we're currently seeing on the front line is the symptom of this war going on for so long. The war has almost reached the 2-year mark, with the 18th of February being today and the 24th of February being 6 days from now, marking the second anniversary of the Russo-Ukrainian war. And we're seeing that the Russians are pushing on the eastern parts by Bakhmut in the Avdiivka direction, in the direction of Zaporizhia. They will likely expand to the direction of Volodar, increase their efforts in the direction of Kreminna by the Kreminna area, Terny, Yampolivka, so on, Sinkivka and Kupiansk in the north. As such, the Russians would be attacking on the whole front line. Meanwhile, the Ukrainians are struggling to even hold their positions, much less build a reserve force that can lead to a new offensive by the Ukrainians. The Ukrainians are not receiving enough ammunition, they're not receiving enough equipment, and even if they were, they do not have the necessary manpower to continue fighting at this rate. The Ukrainians are even struggling to further mobilize. Their mobilization efforts have significantly increased in the direction of Odessa, Mykolaiv, Kharkiv, and so on, the pro-Russian cities. They are cities with the most Russian speakers. Meanwhile, the other areas of Kiev, Lviv, and so on has much less mobilization taking place. The ethnic minority areas, like in the borders with Romania, Hungary, and Slovakia, also have a significantly higher level of mobilization compared to other areas. This is, of course, the same with Russia. In the most Siberian regions, and even foreigners are reported to volunteer to the Russian army en masse. As such, there is a report that about up to 15,000 people from Nepal have volunteered for the Russian army. As such, we see reports that the Russian army is not just mobilizing its own population through this volunteer system, they're mobilizing from all of Central Asia. As such, the Russians have a much larger pool to mobilize a large army from. The soldiers fighting in Ukraine will eventually lead to an army of multinationalism. A lot of different nations, a lot of different ethnicities will fight on the Russian side due to the money incentive there is in fighting for Russia. The salary already is many times larger than the average salary in Russia, much less in poorer countries in Africa and in Central Asia. As such, there's a large monetary incentive to joining the Russian army for those people living in those countries. While the Ukrainian foreign volunteer system has significantly decreased since the start of the war, at the start they had a large influx of soldiers fighting for them. Since then it has decreased and now only a few thousand remain, with hardly any new ones coming in. As such, the Ukrainians can only rely on their own, where half the population has already left the country and are not planning on coming back. At the same time, the ones who are inside the country have been mobilized multiple times over. As such, only few remain to be mobilized, and the ones who are not mobilized yet are necessary for the economy to function. If more are mobilized, it would have a huge effect on the economy of the country itself. At the same time, with the Ukrainians firing Solushny, there's also the problem with the army being less loyal to Syrskyi than they were to Solushny, because they disagree more with Syrskyi. They do not like the way he commands and so on. So there's also issue with morale and loyalty and so on. So in the end, the problems that could just be swept under the rug at the start of the war are now all piling up on each other, and every single one of them may be small in and of its own, but together it adds up to many, many problems. And with the lack of funding, with the slowing down of the mobilization, the Ukrainians are struggling to pass the mobilization bill. And the Russians are just increasing production, they're increasing the amount of soldiers they have at the front line, and they are continuously launching these offensive operations. Even if they do not gain a lot of territory, the Ukrainians are forced to plug the gap with additional forces, whether it is new reserves or if it is the elite soldiers who are constantly moving around. It doesn't help that in the Battle of Avdiivka towards the end, it is reported that up to 2,000 soldiers were left behind in Avdiivka. It is also reported by Ukrainian officials, Ukrainian generals, and so on. They're all reporting that they wanted to minimize the casualties as much as possible, but the evacuation did not go as planned. A few people were left behind, mainly wounded, but also others. About 350 wounded, while 850 standard soldiers were left behind because they simply did not have enough time to withdraw properly. And it didn't help that the Russian FAB bombs were dropping about 200 a day, which made it very difficult for reinforcements to arrive at the city and start fighting back. This is why the evacuation was cancelled and some people were left behind, because the 3rd Azov Assault Brigade simply could not enter the city due to the heavy bombardments from the FAB bombs that reached 200 a day, which was significant for such a small area of 30 kilometers square, of which the Russians already controlled 10 kilometers square, so 30% of the city. As such, we see that there's been significant developments throughout the front line since then, and it will continue at this point. I predict throughout 2024 it will be a Russian year, where the Russians will continuously advance throughout the year. The Ukrainians may attempt some counterattacks here and there, and may regain some positions here and there, but all in all, the Russians will gain net territory in 2024, and 2025 will be much, much, much more difficult for Ukraine than 2024 has ever been. 2023 was the year of Ukraine. They did their best in that year and will not do as well for the rest of the war. And that is going to be all for this update. Thank you all for watching and have a great day.